If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. I just wanted to remind you that this podcast has merch, and this podcast is also on Patreon, and there's some perks that come along with joining the Patreon. I will leave the links to both of those things in the show notes. Alexander came from the bottom and worked his way up to the top through his hard work and skill. They say that the only way from the bottom is up. But if that is true, then it is only logical that the opposite is true. Perhaps it is possible to get so high that you believe that nothing can harm you or your reputation, that you now have an armor that makes you indestructible. But if history only teaches you one thing, it should be that is just not the case. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 13th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled, They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was a part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that, during their time, they had to hide a part of their identity from the world. So while I fully believe that those who were out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserve to be praised and recognized, those are not the people that I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now, I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms that I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So, some of these subjects obviously would not have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using. But I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that, in their time, there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are a rainbow. And for this week, I am talking about Alexander Hamilton one more time. This is Alexander Hamilton Part 3, so there were 2 episodes before this one, and I recommend that you listen to those first, but if this is where you want to start, that's okay. And if you need a recap, don't worry, I got you. Here's the recap. Alexander Hamilton was born poor in Nevis on January 11th in either 1755 or 1757. His parents were James A. Hamilton and Rachel Fawcett Levine. There's also a possibility that his father may have been a man named Thomas Stevens. Rachel and James were never married to each other. Rachel was actually married to someone else when she had Alexander. Rachel had a son named Peter with her husband. James took off and Rachel died before Alexander reached adulthood. Alexander wrote a letter to his father about a hurricane, and that impressed some people that paid for Alexander to go to college in North America. Alexander may have been romantically involved with his college roommate, Robert Troup. Alexander had always had a love for learning, but his studies were put on hold when the American Revolutionary War broke out. Alexander fought in the war under George Washington for the American side. Alexander and George became besties. During the war, Alexander met 2 men named Lafayette and John Lawrence. He may have been romantically involved with both of the men. though he probably was not involved with Lafayette, but John Lawrence is another story. America ended up winning the war, obviously, and becoming its own country. Alexander married a woman named Elizabeth Schuyler. She went by Eliza. Her family had money, but there seems to have been real love between the two of them. They had 8 children together. Alexander had a flirty relationship with his sister-in-law, Angelica Schuyler, though there's no evidence that there was ever a physical affair between the two of them. Alexander's main goal in life was to social climb. He was appointed to the Confederation of Congress. He played a key role in forming America in its early days. He defended the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson was a rival of his. He came up with the whiskey tax. That didn't go well. And he was the first United States Secretary of the Treasury. Last week, I told you that I would start this episode with telling you about the election of 1791. The Senate race of the New York Senate race of 1791. But since then, I found out some information about Frances Antill. That was the orphan that Alexander raised for 10 years. So I'm going to go back a bit and tell you about her. So that's where we're starting this episode this week. Frances Antill was born in 1785. She was the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel Edward Antill and Charlotte Riveren. Alexander was Frances's godfather. Charlotte died in 1785. After this, Edward suffered hard times and he had a breakdown, so he gave Frances to Alexander and Eliza to look after her. And he died on May 23rd, 1789. While Frances was with the Hamiltons, she was treated like one of their own children. When Frances was 12 years old, her older sister Mary was married and able to take care of Frances. So she took Frances in, which I imagine that must have been hard for the Hamiltons after caring for her for 10 years, and also hard for Frances. Now let's talk about the 1791 New York Senate race. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison formed the Democratic-Republican Party. They denounced Alexander and said that he was too friendly to Great Britain. Alexander's father-in-law, Philip Schuyler, was a New York senator. Philip was a Federalist. Aaron Burr was the candidate for the Democratic-Republican Party in the 1791 election. He was a businessman and a fellow lawyer. Aaron beat Philip in that election, and Alexander was pissed that Aaron won, and he blamed Aaron for the results of the election. In 1791, something else happened. In the summer of 1791, Alexander did something that changed his life, career, family, and reputation. It all started when a young 23-year-old blonde woman went knocking on the door of Alexander's Philadelphia home. The woman was named Maria Reynolds. Her name is spelt like it would be pronounced Maria, but it was probably pronounced Mariah. But anyway, Maria told Alexander that she needed his help. Mariah's husband, that had been abusive towards her, had ran off with another woman, leaving behind her and her daughter. Her husband, James Reynolds, had left her with no money. She needed some money so she could go back to where she was from, which was New York. At this time, Alexander was extremely powerful. He was the second most powerful man in the country because at this time he was still the Secretary of the Treasury. Alexander decided to help Maria. So later that night, Alexander took $30 to where Maria was staying. Maria took Alexander to the bedroom, and Alexander began having an affair with her. This was not just a one-time thing either. This affair would go on for a year. When Alexander's wife, Eliza, took their children on vacation to Albany to visit her father, Alexander would invite Maria over so they could have sex in the house that he shared with his wife. Mariah's husband returned on December 15th, 1791. Mariah wrote this to Alexander, quote, I have not time to tell you the cause of my present troubles, only that Mr. has wrote you this morning, and I know not whether you have got the letter or not. And he has swore that if you do not answer it, or if he does not see or hear from you today, he will write Mrs. Hamilton. He has just gone out, and I am alone. I think you had better come here one moment that you may know the cause, then you will the better know how to act. Oh my God, I feel more for you than myself, and wish I had never been born to give you so much unhappiness. Do not write to him, no, not a line, but come here soon. Do not send or leave anything in his power. End quote. 2 days later, Alexander got another letter. This time, it was from James Reynolds. This is what the letter said, quote, It's true, it's in your power to do a great deal for me, but it's of your power to do anything that will restore to me my happiness again, for if you should give me all you possess, would not do it. God knows I love the woman and wish every blessing may attend her. You have been the cause of winning her love, and I don't think I can be reconciled to live with her when I know I haunt her love. Now, sir, I have considered on the matter seriously. I have this proposal to make to you. Give me the sum of $1,000, and I will leave the town and take my daughter with me and go where my friend shan't hear from me, and leave her to yourself to do for her as you think proper. I hope you won't think my request is in a view of making me satisfaction for the injury done me, for there is nothing that you can do will compensate for it. End quote. Alexander paid James $1,000, which is about the equivalent to $25,000 in today's money. But James did not leave town. Mariah would send Alexander a 18th century booty call. She would write for Alexander to come over, and he would. It's possible that at this point that Mariah was in on the scheme, or maybe she was in on it from the beginning. We don't know. So when Mariah would send Alexander a letter, he would go running to her. Then, after Alexander and Mariah had their little rumble and tumble in the sheets, Mariah's husband, James, would then ask Alexander for more money. It wouldn't be $1,000 like the first payment was. It would only be about $30 or $40 each time, and this did happen multiple times. In the end, Alexander ended up paying over $1,300 in blackmail payments, including the initial payment. I don't know if Alexander was in love with Mariah or if the sex was just that good that he couldn't stop, but to continue on with the affair and just accept that the price of continuing on with the affair is to continue to be blackmailed is incredibly stupid. Now, if you think things couldn't possibly get any worse for Alexander than being blackmailed by the husband of his mistress, then just wait, because it does get worse. Blackmailing Alexander wasn't the only scheme that James Reynolds was involved in. He was also purchasing pensions and back pay claims of Revolutionary War soldiers. He was caught doing this in November of 1792, and he was imprisoned for committing forgery. So James found himself in a bit of a pickle. So he thought his new friend Alexander Hamilton would help him out. Alexander refused to help him. Alexander was probably thinking, oh, this is good for me. I can continue on with my affair with Mariah, and I no longer have to pay money for it. But James getting caught for forgery was actually not good for Alexander. James was pissed that Alexander was not going to help him. So James wanted revenge. James let Alexander's rivals know that he had information that could put an end to the beloved Alexander Hamilton. They, of course, wanted to hear this information. James Monroe, a congressman and another founding father, with other congressmen Frederick Muhlenberg and Abraham Venable, paid James a little visit in jail, and they also went and saw Mariah. James painted himself a victim of Alexander's. He said that Alexander basically made him share his wife. He left out the part that he had been blackmailing Alexander. What he added was that the scheme that James had going on with the soldiers' pensions and back pay claims involved Alexander, which was not true. James Monroe and Frederick Malmenberg approached Alexander in December of 1792 with letters Mariah had given them that were supposed to be to her from Alexander. And they asked him what was going on. Which, if this happened today, I don't think a political figure would go to their rival with information that was damning enough to potentially ruin their career and reputation and maybe even their life. I think they would just ruin their rival by exposing them, or I think at least most would. Alexander admitted to the affair and told them about the blackmail. The men believed that the only thing that Alexander was guilty of was being a hoe. So they agreed to keep the affair private. But that was not the end of things. James Monroe made copies of Mariah's letters and gave them to Thomas Jefferson. The Republican clerk of the House of Representatives, John Beckley, may have also secretly made some copies. In 1796, Alexander wrote an essay, and in this essay, he talked some smack about Thomas Jefferson's personal life. He basically said that Thomas Jefferson's humility and simplicity was all fake, and he was all about pleasure, comfort, and high living. James Callender was a Republican and writer. He knew what Alexander's letters to Mariah said. Alexander blamed James Monroe and Thomas Jefferson for this, but it was probably John Beckley's doing. James Callender wrote a pamphlet called The History of the United States for 1796. In this pamphlet, he said that Alexander had been involved in James Reynolds' scheme, and he said, quote, "In the secretary's bucket of chastity, a drop more or less was not to be perceived." End quote. This pamphlet left Alexander in a difficult spot. If he denied everything that James Callender said, he knew that it could be easily proven that he did have an affair with Mariah. And if it was proven that he lied about the affair, then who would believe him when he said that he was not involved in James Reynolds' financial scheme? But admitting to the affair was not ideal either. It could ruin his marriage and his social standing. So his choices were be destroyed because of a lie or be destroyed because of the truth. Alexander chose the truth. He, the Secretary of the Treasury, could not be involved in a financial scandal. If people believed that he was in on James Reynolds' scheme, not only could it take Alexander down and end his career, but it could also cause bad things for the Federalist Party. And that was something that Alexander just could not have on his legacy. Alexander decided not only was he going to tell the truth, but he was going to tell the whole truth. He published a pamphlet titled Observations on Certain Documents. The pamphlet was 95 pages long. In this pamphlet, there were the letters from both James and Mariah Reynolds, and he went into great detail about his affair from start to finish. He painted himself a victim of a scam. He tried to justify his cheating. He tried to show that Mariah Reynolds was just too hard to resist. He said, quote, "The variety of shapes her body could assume were endless," end quote. Which that is just one of history's poorest excuses for adultery, and I'm sure Eliza loved reading that part of the pamphlet. Alexander even admitted that he had conducted part of the affair in his home, and he encouraged Eliza to stay in Albany. That way he could spend more time with his side piece. This pamphlet really painted himself as a lovesick puppy. In one of the letters written on May 2nd, 1792, James forbade Alexander from seeing Mariah. On June 2nd, Mariah begged Alexander to see her. A week later, James asked to borrow $300, and Alexander gave him the $300. No one now believed that Alexander had anything to do with James's scheme, but it came at a cost. And the price was not just paid by Alexander. Eliza, the real victim in all of this, if you ask me, had to pay the price as well. First off, I imagine she was heartbroken and humiliated. But there was even a Republican newspaper called Aurora that said that Eliza had to be just as wicked as her husband. This was America's first political sex scandal. It damaged Alexander's reputation, and it took away the chance of Alexander holding any future political office, including becoming the President of the United States. Alexander blamed James Monroe for his damaged reputation. When James Callender had wrote that pamphlet about Alexander, Alexander asked James Monroe, Frederick Muhlenberg, and Abraham Venable if they would dispute the charges. He wrote James a letter asking him that on July 5th, 1797. By July 10th, Alexander hadn't heard anything back from James, and so he wrote James another letter telling him that he wanted an interview with him, which meant he was insinuating a duel. The next day, Alexander showed up to James's house with his brother-in-law, John Church. James had his friend David Galston there with him, and things got really heated. Alexander told James, quote, "I will meet you like a gentleman," which was another challenge for a duel. James replied back to him, quote, "I am ready, get your pistols." It got so heated that John Church and David Galston had to separate the two of them. A week later, James gave Alexander a detailed account of what he knew about Alexander's affair with Mariah Reynolds. And it appeared that James thought that the whole affair was just a ruse and Alexander was involved in James Reynolds' scheme. Heated letters were exchanged between the two of them. James Monroe wrote to Alexander and he hinted that he wanted to duel. You had to be really vague about wanting to duel. Alexander accepted. He said that his friend Major Jackson would set up a time and place. So James contacted his second. His second was Aaron Burr. Remember him? He was the one that beat Philip Schuyler in the New York Senate race. Aaron had a letter from James that said that Alexander just misunderstood his words and he didn't want to duel. But Alexander was like, "Nope, we are doing this." So James told Aaron that he needed 3 months to get his affairs in order. Aaron thought the men were being childish, and he was able to get them to both cool their tits by August of 1797. But the pissing match started back up again when Alexander published the pamphlet that detailed his affair, because with that pamphlet, Alexander had published his letters with James Monroe. James got pissed and told Aaron to tell Alexander that he wanted to duel. All of James's friends were like, "Dude, move on and let it go." But James refused to. Eventually, things did cool down between the two of them, and they never ended up dueling, but they never became friends. And Eliza also blamed James Monroe for how things went down. Personally, I think the blame should go to Alexander, since he was the one that put his quill in Mariah Reynolds' ink, but that's just my opinion. Eliza carried that anger towards James Monroe for the rest of his days. James Monroe died on July 4th, 1831, though Eliza was somehow able to forgive Alexander. Now, I know in the musical Hamilton, Eliza burns all of her letters with Alexander. And it is true that she burned a lot of their letters, but she didn't burn them all because I've read you some of them. And we don't know why or when she burned the letters. Though it was common for people back then to burn their correspondence. But if she did burn the letters because she was pissed at her husband, and taking a match to those letters was some kind of release of anger for her. I can respect that. I love history and I want to read those letters that she burned, but if she needed her Lisa Left Eye Lopez moment, I can respect that. If you want to know what happened to Mariah Reynolds, she ended up divorcing her husband, and Aaron Burr was her lawyer. In 1794, Alexander played a key role in the Jay Treaty. This treaty patched up some issues that the Treaty of Paris caused, and the treaty helped avoid another war with Great Britain. And it established 10 years of peaceful trade between America and Great Britain. Alexander resigned as Secretary of the Treasury. He tendered his resignation on December 1st, 1794, and he left his post on January 31st, 1795. He did this because Eliza had had a miscarriage during the Whiskey Rebellion, and he wanted to be closer to her. After he resigned, he went back to practicing law in New York. Even though Alexander resigned, he still remained besties with George Washington. Alexander even helped write George's farewell address when he left office. The next president of the United States was another founding father. His name was John Adams. Alexander and John did not have the relationship that Alexander and George had. John hated the influence that Alexander had with George. John thought that Alexander was overambitious and scandalous in his personal life, which I'm not sure why John thought that Alexander was scandalous. I mean, he was, but I don't know why John Adams thought this, because this would have been before the Reynolds affair would have been made public. I don't know if maybe Alexander wasn't so secret about his relationship with John Laurens or his flirtation with Angelica Schuyler. I get the sense that Alexander was probably a flirt, although the story of George Washington's wife Martha naming her tomcat after Alexander Hamilton was probably just British propaganda. But I don't know if Alexander being a flirt was what John Adams was talking about. I don't know. But the feeling of dislike was mutual. You need to know how elections worked in 1796 because it's a little different than how it is done in the United States today. Each presidential elector had 2 votes. They had to cast their votes for 2 different men from different states. The man with the most votes became president, and the man that came in second place became vice president. The Federalists wanted most people to vote for John Adams and for a few to vote for a man named Thomas Pinckney. That way, John Adams would become president and Thomas Pinckney would become vice president. Alexander encouraged Northern electors to vote for John Adams and Thomas Pinckney so that Thomas Jefferson would not become president. But he encouraged South Carolina electors to vote for Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Pinckney. That way, Thomas Pinckney would become president and John Adams would remain the vice president. Other Federalists found out about Alexander's plan, so they voted for John Adams, but not Thomas Pinckney. And instead, they voted for Thomas Jefferson. So John Adams became president and Thomas Jefferson became vice president. From the years 1798 to 1800, America was involved in the Quasi-War. That was an undeclared naval war between America and France. What it was over was, in 1793, Congress had suspended repayment of French loans that America got during the American Revolutionary War. France also did not like the Jay Treaty. So France started attacking American vessels. Now, during this time, John Adams was president of the United States. George Washington gave Alexander a strong endorsement, and so reluctantly, John made Alexander a major general of the army. George insisted that Alexander be made the senior major general, Major General Henry Knox, remember him from last week's episode? He was the one that Alexander McDougall told him that he should start a mutiny. Henry declined to serve as Alexander's junior because he thought that it would be degrading to serve beneath Alexander. Alexander was Inspector General of the United States Army from July 18, 1798 to June 15, 1800. George Washington didn't want to leave his home in Mount Vernon unless he had to command an army in the field, so Alexander was the de facto head of the army, which did not please John Adams. Alexander wanted a direct tax to be passed to fund the war. He urged the new Secretary of the Treasury, Oliver Wolcott Jr., to tax houses instead of land. Eventually, taxes were on land, houses, and slaves. Different states had different rates and required assessments of houses. And there was a Stamp Act that was like the one the British had before the Revolution. There was some resistance to this in southeastern Pennsylvania. One of the men resisting was a man named John Fries. He had marched with George Washington against the Whiskey Rebellion. George Washington died on December 14th, 1799. When he died, Alexander became the default senior officer of the army. He was the senior officer until June 15th, 1800. John Adams made peace with the French, and the war ended on September 30th, 1800. During this war, John Adams found out that some of his cabinet were more loyal to Alexander than they were to him. So John fired the Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, and Secretary of War, James McHenry, in May of 1800. After this, Alexander's service in the army was over. In 1800, Alexander was a lawyer in America's first murder trial. The murder victim was Julia Sands. She went by Elma. She disappeared on the evening of December 22nd, 1799. Elma's cousin, Catherine Sands, said that Elma told her that on the night of December 22nd, Elma was going to secretly marry a man named Levi Weeks. Elma's body was found on January 2nd, 1800, in a well. Levi was charged with Elma's murder. Levi's lawyers were Henry Brockholst Livingston, Aaron Burr, and Alexander. The trial took place on March 31st, 1800, and April 1st. The evidence was just circumstantial. Levi had some witnesses testify that he was with his brother Ezra and friends that night. One of the three judges, Chief Justice John Lansing Jr., instructed the jury that there was not enough evidence to find Levi guilty. The jury came back with a not guilty verdict after 5 minutes. The public, however, did not agree with the verdict, and they criticized John Lansing's instructions to the jury. Levi was so hated afterwards that he had to leave New York and move to Mississippi. In November of 1799, the New Daily Advertiser, the last newspaper in New York City, reprinted an article that said that Alexander had tried to buy the Philadelphia Aurora to close it down. That was the newspaper that had talked shit about Eliza. The article said that Alexander tried to buy the newspaper with British Secret Service money. Alexander urged the New York Attorney General to prosecute the publisher for serious libel. The prosecution was able to compel the owner to close the newspaper. The election of 1800 was a heated one. If you think American politics getting nasty is a recent thing, you would be wrong. James Callender, the same one that wrote about Alexander's affair, wrote that John Adams had a, quote, hideous hermaphroditical character. A Federalist writer that went by the name Burleigh said that if Thomas Jefferson won the election, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced. End quote. This time, John Adams was running with Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. He was John Adams's former running mate's older brother. Thomas Jefferson's running mate was Aaron Burr. Alexander was up to his old tricks. He was going around telling electors that they should vote for Charles Cotesworth Pinckney instead of John Adams. Alexander wrote a pamphlet called Letter from Alexander Hamilton concerning the public conduct and character of John Adams, Esquire, President of the United States. This pamphlet was highly critical of John Adams, but he ended it with a half-hearted endorsement. John did not win the election. Thomas Jefferson had beat him. It should have been a clear victory for Thomas, but one of the Republican electors did not withhold his vote like he was expected to. So Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr each got exactly 73 electoral votes. That meant that the election was in the hands of the House of Representatives. The Federalists had control of the House during this time. Most of them favored Aaron Burr over Thomas Jefferson. Aaron would not confirm that he would turn down the presidency if the House picked him. This was a mistake. This made some believe that the presidency was what he was aiming for. Alexander was one of those people. No one could ever call Alexander a fan of Thomas Jefferson. They disagreed on just about every political issue. But he believed that Aaron Burr was just running for solely his own ambition. From mid-December to late January of 1801, Alexander took his quill to pen and wrote many letters to his fellow Federalists. He wanted to convince them that Thomas Jefferson was the one that should get their vote. He wrote to Oliver Wolcott Jr. on December 16th, quote, "There is no doubt but that upon every virtuous and prudent calculation, Jefferson is to be preferred. He is by far not so dangerous a man and has pretensions to character." End quote. If this had happened a few years earlier, Alexander may have had more influence, but the Reynolds affair had an impact on Alexander's reputation, and it was not a good one. And his many attacks on John Adams also did not help him. The House began voting on February 11, 1801. The Constitution mandated that each state's delegation in the House vote as a single block to determine the election. Delaware Federalist James A. Baynard was the lone representative of his state in 1800. James voted for Aaron Burr. That brought Aaron's total to 6 states. Thomas Jefferson had 8. The delegations from Vermont and Maryland were split evenly, so they did not vote. There was no clear winner. The nation was almost on the brink of chaos. Republican newspapers suggested that military intervention may have to be possible, and groups of unofficial Republican and Federalist militia began preparing for a potential civil war. James Bayard started to rethink his choice, and this may have been because of Alexander. James suggested in a caucus that he might vote for Thomas Jefferson to prevent a constitutional crisis. One Federalist shouted, "Deserter!" at him. James met with 2 friends of Thomas Jefferson, John Nicholas of Virginia and Samuel Smith of Maryland. James wanted to know what a Jefferson presidency would look like. Would he leave certain Federalist policies like Alexander's financial system and office holders in place? He was assured he would. On February 17, 1801, James submitted a blank ballot. Delegations in Vermont and Maryland voted for Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson would become the 3rd president of the United States. That meant that Aaron Burr was going to be the vice president. This was decided 2 weeks before Inauguration Day. Federalists would never win another presidential race, and by 1815, the Federalists were no longer a party. Thomas Jefferson didn't allow Aaron Burr to have any influence in his administration, and he even dropped him from the ticket in the next election. In 1801, tragedy hit the Hamilton family. On July 4th, 1801, a lawyer named George Eaker gave an Independence Day speech. This was hosted by a New York State Militia Brigade and by Tammany Society. That was a political organization that Aaron Burr had built into a political machine. George said in his speech that Alexander would not be opposed to using force to overthrow Thomas Jefferson. On November 20th, 1801, Alexander's oldest son, Philip, Philip's friend Stephen Price, and George Eaker were all attending a play at the Park Theater. Philip was pissed at what George had said about his father. Philip and Stephen approached George. It is possible that Philip and Stephen were drunk. They had a little heated discussion. George called Philip and Stephen damn rascals. Philip and Stephen challenged George to a duel. Some acquaintances wrote that Alexander told his son to throw away his shot. Stephen Price first dueled George. 4 shots were fired, but no one was injured. Philip dueled with George on November 23rd, 1801. Philip took his uncle John Barker Church's pistols to Paulus Hook, New Jersey. Today that is Jersey City. Philip wasted his shot, and so did George. After that, they stared at each other, and then George raised his pistol, and then Philip raised his. Philip was shot above his right hip. The bullet went through his body and lodged in his left arm. Philip fired his gun before he hit the ground, but that may have just been an involuntary spasm. His bullet did nothing. He was rushed across the river and taken to his Aunt Angelica's house. Alexander rushed to get Dr. David Hosack. The doctor was already on his way. Alexander fainted when he arrived at the doctor's house. When Alexander arrived at Angelica's house, the doctor said that Alexander, quote, instantly turned from the bed, and taking me by the hand, which he grasped with all the agony of grief, he exclaimed in a tone and manner that could not be effaced from my memory, Doctor, I despair. Philip died at 5 a.m. on November 24th, 1801. He was 19 years old. At Philip's funeral, Alexander had to be held up by his friends and family as he approached Philip's grave due to his grief. Alexander's 17-year-old daughter Angelica was never the same after Philip's death. She had a mental breakdown. She would talk to Philip like he was still alive. Sometimes she could not recognize family members, and she stayed in a childlike state for the rest of her life. Eliza was pregnant at the time of Philip's death. The child that Eliza was pregnant with was named Philip after his late brother. Alexander and his half-brother Peter Levine were estranged. We don't know much about their relationship. We know that they knew each other, and while Peter ended up moving to Georgia, and that's actually where he died, during the American Revolutionary War, Peter was a Tory. He fought for the British side. And of course, we know Alexander fought for the American side. Peter died in 1801, and when he did, Alexander wrote to Eliza, and this is what he wrote. Quote, I have received intelligence from a gentleman of Georgia. He tells me of the death of my brother Levine. You know the circumstances that abate my distress. Yet my heart acknowledges the rights of a brother. He dies rich, but he has disposed of the bulk of his fortune to strangers. I am told he has left me a legacy. I do not inquire how much. End quote. In 1804, Aaron Burr ran for the governor of New York. Alexander had advised people not to vote for him. Aaron did not win the election. Word got to Aaron that Alexander did what he could to make sure that Aaron lost. Aaron was, of course, pissed. Aaron challenged Alexander to a duel. Alexander wrote Eliza a letter a few days before the duel. This was written on July 4th, 1804. This is what the letter said. Quote, "This letter, my very dear Eliza, will not be delivered to you unless I shall first have terminated my earthly career. To begin, as I humbly hope, from redeeming grace and divine mercy, a happy immortality. If it had been possible for me to have avoided the interview, my love for you and my precious children would have been alone a decisive motive. But it was not possible. Without sacrifices which would have rendered me unworthy of your esteem, I need not tell you of the pangs I feel from the idea of quitting you and exposing you to the anguish which I know you would feel. Nor could I dwell on the topic lest it should unman me. The consolations of religion, my beloved, can alone support you, and these you have a right to enjoy. Fly to the bosom of your God and be comforted. With my last idea, I shall cherish the sweet hope of meeting you in a better world. Adieu, best of wives and best of women. Embrace all my darling children for me. Ever yours, A.H." End quote. On the morning of the duel, Alexander spent an hour alone in a room with his college roommate and maybe lover, Robert Troup, the person that he had made the executor of his will back in 1795. Which, a little side note here, letters suggest that Robert Troup may have also had a romantic relationship with none other than Aaron Burr. That is an interesting love triangle. On July 11th, 1804, at 7 a.m., Alexander met Aaron near the same spot where Philip was shot, in Weehawken, New Jersey. Alexander also had the same pistols that Philip used. Aaron picked William Peter Van Ness as his second. William was a lawyer. Alexander chose Nathaniel Pennington as his second. Nathaniel was once a district judge of Georgia. There are two stories about what actually went down. William Van Ness said that Alexander fired first, but he missed Aaron. Nathaniel Pennington said that Aaron took the first shot. What is for certain is Alexander's shot hit and broke a tree branch that was directly above Aaron's head. The other thing that was for certain was that Aaron's shot hit Alexander in his stomach. So perhaps Alexander shot first and missed, or shot up at the sky, and then Aaron took deliberate aim, or maybe Aaron took deliberate aim and Alexander fired his gun when he was falling to the ground. The truth about what happened will be something that we will never know. What is known is Aaron Burr's bullet hit Alexander in his lower abdomen above his right hip. The bullet ricocheted off of his second or third false rib. It fractured it. That caused damage to his internal organs, especially his liver and diaphragm. Then the bullet became lodged in Alexander's first or second lumbar vertebra. Alexander was paralyzed. He was immediately taken to the same doctor that cared for Philip when he was shot in his duel. Alexander asked Benjamin Moore, the Episcopal Bishop of New York, to give him Holy Communion. Benjamin told him no, because dueling was a sin, and Alexander was not a member of the Episcopalian denomination. Benjamin left, but he came back in the afternoon because Alexander's friends pleaded with him. Alexander told him that he had repented for dueling, and so Benjamin agreed to give him communion. For 31 hours, Alexander was surrounded by friends and family. And then at William Bayers Jr.'s house in New York City, he was a banker, Alexander died on July 12, 1804 at 2 p.m. He was either 47 or 49 years old. Alexander was buried in the church cemetery of Trinity Church. He was buried on July 14th, 1804, and the city halted all businesses for the funeral. The Society of the Cincinnati, remember he was the president of that, they organized the 2-mile procession. There were so many participants in that procession that it took hours to complete, and it was reported by newspapers nationwide. Benjamin Moore conducted the service, and Governor Morris gave the eulogy. He also established, secretly, a fund to support Eliza and her and Alexander's children. The public was outraged over the death of Alexander. Aaron Burr fled to St. Simons, Georgia after the duel, but then he returned to Washington, D.C. to complete his term as vice president. He was charged with Alexander's murder in New York and New Jersey. In November of 1804, a grand jury indicted him for Alexander's murder in Bergen County, New Jersey, but the New Jersey Supreme Court quashed it. He ended up getting involved in another controversy, and I'm not going to get into that because that would take too long, and this is not an Aaron Burr episode. But he does get charged with treason, but he gets acquitted. But between that and the duel, his political career was over. Eliza made it her mission for the rest of her life to make sure that her husband was not forgotten. She founded a school and an orphanage in Alexander's honor. The Hamilton Free School was established in northern Manhattan near their home. This school provided free education to children of families who could not afford private education. The Orphan Asylum Society was the city's first private orphanage, which, seeing as Alexander was an orphan that had a love for learning, I cannot think of another way to honor him. This next bit that I have to share with you is really about Eliza and not about Alexander, but it's just too sweet not to share with you. After Alexander's death, Eliza struggled with money and she couldn't afford her mortgage. So some of Alexander's friends got together and bought Eliza's house for $30,500, and then they sold it back to her for $15,000. She did have to end up moving somewhere cheaper in 1813, but I thought Alexander's friends buying her house was such a nice story. For this podcast, I have had to read about some horrible things that people have done, but this story about Eliza's house restored my faith in humanity a little bit. Eliza defended Alexander against his critics after his death. She defended him when people questioned if he helped write George Washington's farewell address. She requested an apology from James Monroe about him accusing Alexander to be involved in James Reynolds' scheme. He gave her an apology shortly after Alexander's death. In 1846, Eliza petitioned Congress to publish Alexander's writings. In June of 1848, Congress bought and published his works. With the help of her son, John Church Hamilton, she reorganized letters, papers, and writings of Alexander's. John then published Alexander's biography titled History of the Republic of the United States America, as traced in the writings of Alexander Hamilton and his contemporaries. Eliza is the reason why we know so much about Alexander. There are some founding fathers that are more famous than others. Like, I'm sure, at least when it comes to Americans, they would be able to say who George Washington was. But they might not know who Robert Morris was. And I'm sure at least most Americans know who Alexander Hamilton was. And that's thanks to Eliza. And, well, the musical Hamilton, but there might not be a musical titled Hamilton had it not been for Eliza. I probably wouldn't have done this many episodes on him had it not been for Eliza. I actually may not have done any episodes on him, which means that this season's theme would be different. So if you have liked these episodes on Alexander Hamilton that I have done, and if you have liked the other episodes that I've done this season and you are enjoying this season's theme, then you have Eliza to thank for that. Alexander's economic philosophy has had a lasting impact on not just America's economy, but other economies around the world. And his political theories have also had a global impact. In 1931, there was a film titled Alexander Hamilton. It was based on a 1917 play titled Hamilton, written by George Arliss and Mary Hamlin. He was a character in the TV series Turn, that was about American spies during the American Revolutionary War. He was a character in the PBS miniseries The Adams Chronicles, the TV film George Washington II, The Forging of a Nation, A&E's TV film The Crossing, and HBO's miniseries John Adams. He is a character in the books The Conqueror by Gertrude Atherton, Burr by Gore Vidal, and the novels The Probability Brooch and North American Confederacy by L. Neil Smith. He is on the U.S. $10 bill, and the plan to replace Alexander on the $10 was canceled due to, in part, to the hit Broadway musical Hamilton. And that was the life of Alexander Hamilton. Thank you so much for listening to the 13th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf. I am going to be covering 15 people this season, and next week is going to be about someone new. Next week's episode is going to be about Florence Nightingale. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. The Instagram is at History_Shelf_pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a shout out to you on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode that I do, and at the end of the episode, I will give you a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want except for the zip-up hoodie. I also have a gig on Fiverr that lets you take out ad space on this podcast. There's also affiliated links for Riverside, Amazon, and Bookshop. And if you click on one of those links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch, and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support this podcast, I turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just said will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is to just continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. It helps with the algorithm. And also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. Alright, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.